This book looks at chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas on one hand, and egalitarian human foragers on another hand, and basically does this comparison of those two groups to try to figure out what is human nature. And one of the conclusions he comes to is that human nature has these two different and in some ways ambivalent and warring parts of ourselves, where one part of us is hierarchical and dominant and despotic, and the other part of us is vigilantly egalitarian. And these two parts are both rooted in human nature, is his argument. And where that egalitarian nature comes from is this resentment at the dominance hierarchy, the resentment at being dominated, combined with an ability for people to sort of come together and form these moral communities, these social communities that can effectively keep down anybody who's trying to dominate others. And there's actually a little bit of a dark side to that egalitarian nature that he uncovers in his observance of these two groups. And of course, especially of the human egalitarian tribes, which he views across continents. There's certain things that these tribes have in common. Actually, he doesn't use the word tribe, he uses the word forager. But he also notices in chimpanzees a bit of this resentment toward the hierarchy and a little tiny bit of this collective action thing going on. And you can actually see that on the cover, even though there's this major green filter. If you look closely at the cover, it's got some chimpanzees who are calling out in a certain type of awe. And he's kind of making the argument that actually when they do this, they are trying to collectively object to the behavior of the alpha male when it is doing something against the tribe. And sometimes this actually works. And another way he has of describing this is that sometime between the common ancestor that humans had with chimpanzees and the modern day, the power hierarchy turned upside down from this despotic situation with the chimps, where you have an alpha chimp at the top and a very clear dominance hierarchy. That pyramid got turned upside down, such that the power is, at least for these egalitarian forager groups, the power is held by the rank and file, by the people who collectively hold in check and have power over anyone who tries to dominate another. And so he's asking the question, how did that happen from an evolutionary standpoint? How did the flipping of the power pyramid even take place? And also, and related to this, given that we look at different groups of humans, some of them are highly despotic. Some of them have really strong hierarchies that are enforced both by the moral community and the social community, while other communities have a more egalitarian nature to them, even though there's this dark side to that egalitarian nature. So what factors determine which society will end up despotic versus egalitarian? And he's trying to look from an evolutionary standpoint at how that might have happened. And here's a couple of quotes that are good introductions to his perspective. The collective power of resentful subordinates is at the base of human egalitarian society, and we can see important traces of this group approach in chimpanzee behavior. It is powerful dispositions to dominance and submission that oblige us to live always in hierarchies of one type or another. And it is our anti-authoritarian tendencies that lead us to limit the power of leaders or other dominants, and that make politically illegitimate despots wary of popular rebellion. This dynamic appears to be universal. So how do chimpanzees show the beginnings of this anti-authoritarian tendency? And it's important to start out by just imagining how hierarchical chimpanzees actually are. Like, researchers can go in and watch the behavior of a group of chimpanzees, and they can easily tell exactly who in the group is higher on the pecking order than who. And this is based on these like habitual dominance and submission signs. Like the dominant chimpanzee will just plow through and expect others to move out of his way. The chimpanzees, when they're exhibiting submissive behavior, will smile in a way that shows their teeth. When a dominant chimpanzee approaches them, they'll present their rump. They will cow down a little bit. So it's really easy to see the dominance and submission behaviors in chimps. And the alpha male chimp does tend to bully other chimps. No, it's not that he doesn't play any social role. Like sometimes he will break up fights between chimps who are lower on the pecking order than himself. But there's a whole lot of bullying that goes on. And yet, these chimps are of course going to feel a resentment of some kind toward being dominated and bullied in this way. And he tells a story of the rank and file among the chimps fighting back just a little bit with this one technique. And the story goes like this. Basically, there was a dominant chimp and a younger male chimp who was courting one of the females. Insofar as chimps can court each other, where chimps are kind of a promiscuous tribe, but in any case, the one younger chimp was courting a specific female, and she had turned down the alpha male in the tribe earlier that day, and yet the alpha male discovered her and the younger chimp who had been courting her. He discovered them in the bushes mating, and the dominant alpha went after them and tried to attack them. But the other chimps who were watching this happen, they began to call out in this aw sound. And he describes how it's different from the E sound. It's sort of like, what is chimp language? And they don't have that many things they can do with their mouths, so it's kind of just aw and E. But he's making the case that the aw sound from chimps is an objection to dominant chimp behavior. So what happened in this scenario was a few of the chimps started to call out aw when they saw this, and other chimps in the tribe joined in, such that the whole group of chimps were all sort of calling out in this objection, watching this happen. And what actually happened was the dominant alpha who was attacking these two younger chimps stopped attacking them because he realized, oh, wait a second, the whole tribe is against me. They might be able to overturn the existing power hierarchy in this tribe. So he stopped and let it go. And in some ways, he's making the argument that this is kind of the beginnings of this movement toward the egalitarian human nature that fully manifests itself in human nature centuries down the road. And here's a great quote on this. Humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos all form small subordinate coalitions that can significantly rearrange the internal balance of power within their groups. Now, how does that chimpanzee behavior compare to the way egalitarian forager groups hold down upstarts? Where an upstart is, in his language, it's basically how he describes somebody that's trying to dominate the group or trying to dominate others. And he gives some really powerful stories from anthropologists' experience in these forager groups, where I'm going to describe one of them that I think kind of gets at the dark side of egalitarianism. So the setup here is you have an anthropologist woman who has spent a couple of years inside this tribe. This is the Utku tribe, and she's living in one of the families, getting to know the community. And there's this situation with sportsmen who are just American sportsmen coming in from the outside. And they come in and ask to borrow a couple of canoes from the tribe. Or tribe isn't the right word. It's not the word he uses. From the group, the forager group. And the sportsmen just asked to borrow. And the group of Utku, their habit is to always say yes and to always lend the canoes. But then behind the sportsmen's backs, they very much resent the sportsmen asking for the canoes. And so this anthropologist knows how much the community resents that behavior. So the next time these sportsmen ask for these canoes, she speaks up and just says, this community really needs those canoes. That's all she says. Like, does that sound like dominant behavior to you? But in many ways, they interpret that as dominant behavior because she's speaking on behalf of the tribe, and she's making a different decision than they collectively have been making for a long time. So they punish her, collectively. And here's the thing, their punishment is not, it's not like direct, it's not directly aggressive, it's very subtly aggressive, which is that they don't visit her for as long, they don't spend as much time with her, they subtly hint that they don't want visits from her, and this sort of subtle shunning feels incredibly oppressive to her as someone who's entirely embedded in this community. And let me read you this quote that I think really sums up how the story played out. It became evident that she was being ostracized, but during the period of estrangement, it also emerged that the Utku were willing to let her rehabilitate herself. Indeed, whenever she was able to control her feelings and avoid the emotionalized negativity for a time, they began to respond positively. The problem was that Briggs could not maintain the flawless equanimity that the situation seemed to demand. She was being distanced. It hurt. And when she broke down and showed her frustration, she was distanced even more. And you can see how oppressive something like that might feel when you're embedded in this as your only social outlet. Now, this kind of social control over upstarts, this like collective group control over people who try to dominate, this does seem to be consistent across different continents of egalitarian foragers, according to his research. He says, egalitarian foragers uniformly eschew strong, authoritative leadership. Now, of course, sometimes these communities need the services of a leader in order to coordinate something or to help out with some task. But even when that happens, the communities keep that person in check. He says, usually it is the rank and file who dominate, and the would-be political upstart who submits. Once in a while, the tables are turned temporarily. And what means do the communities have for holding potential upstarts, potential leaders in check? And number one, of course, is the type of social shunning that story illustrated. But also there's disobeying orders. Like he talks about when there's a leader who's in charge of leading some little task, sometimes they'll sort of step beyond the scope of their leadership realm, and people will just disobey them. Like the community will just like ignore the orders they're giving them in this kind of little passive-aggressive way of making sure that that leader doesn't take that power to his head. And then the third tactic these communities use to keep people in check is if someone really does start to be a problem, and if they're not responsive to the community's shunning and disobeying, sometimes communities will actually execute somebody who's become too much of a dominant personality. And this isn't common, like it is rare, but it is consistent across different continents of forager groups that they study, that occasionally they will execute in some way or another. So he tells a story about one of the communities that executed one of their upstarts that was a problem by just not helping that person when the enemy came for them. So the enemy killed them technically, but the community could have stepped in and saved them, and collectively they all chose not to. And then he tells other stories of, for example, times when the community executes one of these people who has gotten too out of line and too dominant, and the whole community, in one case, stabbed this person to sort of represent the collective decision that that person needed to be executed. Now, it's worth noting that there is still violence in these communities. In fact, there's quite high rates of violence among these groups. It's just not the within-group public space where that violence takes place. The violence basically takes place between different forager groups, sort of in this tribal way. It also takes place sort of as revenge killings between people who are oftentimes in different groups, though not always. And then within the household. So domestic violence did seem to be a thing. And so in some ways you can think of the kind of violent and hierarchical nature of humans manifesting itself in spaces such as in the home and between tribes, that it was not allowed to be manifest in the community. Like in these communities, there was relatively low levels of conflict, at least on the surface. And here's a quote. "Foragers do have very high homicide rates, but they also exhibit a relatively low level of lesser conflict and are heavily preoccupied with the maintenance of social harmony." Now, all of this raises a couple of different questions, where the first is, how did humans evolve this egalitarian nature? Like, how did we get from some common ancestor with chimps to the current manifestation of humans? And then second, and largely related, is the question of why are there so many different types of human communities, where some of these communities are super despotic and super hierarchical, and other human communities are like these egalitarian foragers and very much keep all potential leaders in check. And so what environmental manifestations are going to determine what a particular type of human group ends up like? And he has this sort of range of communities where you've got egalitarian tribes on one side, which is the groups he's studying for this whole book. But then you also have what he calls big man societies, which are kind of like egalitarian tribes, but these will also have a big man in the group who maybe trades with other groups and has a little bit higher status because he's bringing in resources for the group that's beneficial. But still that big man is held in check by the egalitarian community. And then there are going to be tribes and then chiefdoms, where tribes are kind of in between chiefdoms and egalitarian groups. So, and of course, like you look at society today and there's this huge hierarchical structure. So how do you get those different variations of humans? And he does point out that gorillas actually have different levels of despotism and different sizes of communities, depending on whether they're in the field or whether they're in the forest. So he is really on the lookout when he's thinking about the nature of these groups for environmental factors. Now, in answering this question about how we got from a common ancestor with chimps to modern-day humans, one part of his story has to do with weapons. And the notion here is that when you have weapons, the hierarchy that is going to develop is much less stable. So any one chimp who ends up at the top of the dominance hierarchy can kind of maintain that position by eating more food and thus maintaining his physical strength. And his physical strength, if there's no weapons, that's the source of his power in that group. But when you introduce weapons, suddenly it's not about physical strength, which can be maintained with food. It's more about how aptly you use the weapons. And so if you get a chimp who's underneath you, who just sort of gains the brain power for using weapons and knocks that dominant alpha male chimp off that top of the hierarchy, then there's way more instability and there will be more frequent shifting back and forth. And of course, what that's going to do is it's going to make it way more attractive, even for the person who's at the top of the hierarchy. It's way more attractive for everybody to keep that dominant person in check. Like if you know that next week you could be knocked off the top of the hierarchy and someone else could be above you, you're much more likely to be on board with the holding in check of power that comes from the group's standpoint. And here's a quote on this. "When killing becomes both easy and rapid, the balance of power between two combatants becomes more a matter of skill and tool use than a matter of canine size, jaw strength, and body size and strength. Thus, after weapons arrived, the camp bully became far more vulnerable. Weapons not only made the outcomes of dyadic fights far less predictable, they also made it much easier for a group to implement extreme sanctions against a powerful or over-aggressive deviant. It is for this reason that the use of efficient hunting weapons was critical to the definitive reversing of hierarchies in prehistoric bands. Now, weapons aren't the only factor here, because obviously language is going to play a pretty big role when it comes to the ability of the rank and file, the ability of the group to coordinate among each other to hold a bully in check. And once language arrived on the scene, it made possible these moral communities who held the bully in check through a common moral understanding. And he actually makes the case that even in really despotic human groups, you still have the community holding the leader in check through public opinion. And here's a quote on that. Even in a highly despotic primitive kingdom, where the leader rules by coercive force, the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate use of power continues to be defined by public opinion. Now, language and moral communities are going to relate to culture. And of course, he's a cultural anthropologist, and he actually has a quote in here that I think goes really well with behavioral economics in terms of people's habits in a community. Those play in with the culture, and the culture, therefore, is going to kind of reinforce any either hierarchical or egalitarian nature that's built into the community. So let me just give this behavioral economics-y quote. As highly cultural animals, humans tend to automatically conform to prior decision patterns. We tend to also make such conformity normative, and therefore, in many cases, we think strategically about why conformity is needed. Cultural traditions are free to reinforce certain aspects of human nature and to suppress others. And I found that last framing really helpful. For example, we do still have this chimpanzee hierarchical nature to us that has some aggressive features to it. And a lot of culture is sort of suppressing that aggression in certain contexts. And yet he also makes the point that, yeah, we have some really wonderful parts to human nature, including our care for each other, our altruism, which I'll get to in just a second, and just other features of love between humans that culture can actually bring out and accentuate and encourage. But in this book, really, he's trying to make the case that actually, if we're going to study culture, maybe it does matter what human nature is. And that's especially the case if culture is essentially built on top of human nature. Now, all of these factors I've just gone over, that is the weapons, the language, the moral communities, and the culture, he is making the case that the advent of these were key moments in the evolution of mankind toward a more egalitarian beast. But he also points to Milton Friedman, who came up with the idea that sort of control over resources, an ability to store grains and store resources and therefore accumulate, that actually moves humans more toward the despotic side of this spectrum. Because, of course, if you can accumulate your grain in a barn that you own, in a territory that you can defend against your neighbor, then you can maintain dominance in a way that you can't as easily if you live in a foraging tribe that's always moving around, where it's just harder to accumulate over time. And in this case, he's also pointing out that actually if you compare ownership of cows versus ownership of grains, grains are easier to store and accumulate, and therefore grains will be associated with more despotism, whereas cows can be way more easily transferred between people, and therefore you'd expect a society that's built on resources that are easily moved between people to be more on the egalitarian side. Now, he also makes a case in this book for altruism as part of human nature. And his basic argument here is that because of all this stuff we've been talking about, that within group selection, especially on the level of aggression, is diminished through this moral community. And the between group selection, or it's probably more like between lineage selection, is increased. So the first part of this is going to be the within group selection that he believes is reduced because of these moral communities and because the rank and file are holding the bully in check. And part of this is, if you think about phenotype, like the expression of behavior, as being the real thing that selection acts upon, the moral community kind of minimizes differences between people's behavior, at least in terms of how aggressive or how dominant they are. Like within a group, you don't get the most dominant having a competitive advantage inside the group. In fact, it could even be the reverse if the dominant personality rises up too often and gets shunned by the group or killed or whatnot. In which case, there's less variation that's exhibited in behavior, even if it's felt inside the heart. The fact that the moral community makes everyone's behavior more equal means that will not become a major selection factor within the group. And then, of course, across groups, there's going to be a couple factors here, mainly solving the free rider problem and war. Where solving the free rider problem means when we share resources, that of course benefits the whole group by acting as essentially insurance for the group. Like if one family gets a boar or gets some animal, they share it with the whole tribe based on this moral community that doesn't allow one group to dominate. But that means that everybody is more likely to have resources since they're going to share with whoever is most successful for that month. And essentially solving the free rider problem and creating collective work toward the common interests of the group, that's of course going to benefit the long-run survival of that group. But war is also a factor here, because the people who are willing to sacrifice their own life for their group on behalf of their community, that kind of group that produces that kind of person is probably going to be more successful in a war environment. And that of course, that success will propagate the lineage that led to that powerful war group. So that's another factor that's going to favor altruistic genes in this between tribes evolutionary nature. And here's a quote on that. "Warfare rose precisely because this risky activity is predicated on a strong capacity for self-sacrifice, and therefore on altruistic genes." Now, I do have a couple of critiques of the book, although in a lot of ways these are minor, and I think his contribution in this book is really profound. A couple of my critiques relate to the altruistic section of the book, where he doesn't talk about lineage selection. He uses the word group selection. But of course, any group of people who's banded together, they're very likely to have relational, like lineage connections to each other. So pointing out that actually selection at a lineage level matters, probably even more than group level selection, just would have been helpful. And then my other critique around the altruism section is I just thought he could have spent more time explaining what exactly he meant by altruism, because there's a lot of different ways of understanding that language, and there wasn't a large discussion of it. And then my next critique is more just something that I think builds on his ideas, that I wish he would have at least mentioned or alluded to. And that is the way the moral community can be wielded as a weapon for one's own advantage. And of course, gossip is the key thing here. Like, what is the function of gossip? part of the function of gossip is enforcement and consensus making when it comes to these moral communities. Like, what behaviors will people talk about negatively and shun you a little bit for? And those behaviors are essentially determined through the means of gossip in many cases. So I think it's important to recognize that even if you've got this egalitarian tribe that's enforcing this egalitarian moral code, that moral code itself can be weaponized through gossip and through other means. And I think that is going to be incredibly important when we think about how human societies evolved. Now, he did bring up gossip a little bit, so let me give a few quotes that he did mention. Gossiping brings individual reproductive benefits through rewarding social interaction and through exchange of information about subsistence. And another quote, I have tended to portray sanctioning as though entire groups spontaneously begin to criticize or ridicule or ostracize overly assertive leaders, almost as though a group mind is at work. I suggest that everywhere, the process of arriving at a sanctioning decision is similar to an Anga clan's war meeting. Individuals begin to grope toward a group resolution of the problem, initially by gossiping behind the deviant's back and carefully watching the reactions of others. And then my last critique is somewhat related to that one, which is that if you look closely at these communities with egalitarian natures and low levels of conflict, a lot of times the conflict manifests itself differently. Like, it's not that there isn't conflict, and it's not that there isn't necessarily one person dominating a little bit. It's just more subtle and hard to see. Like, gossip is obviously one example of this, where gossip can be an incredibly aggressive act. And similarly, with groupthink, you have some people who are really good at navigating social settings, at getting their way socially, and that could be through charisma, it could be through subtly putting fear of judgment in people's minds. And he doesn't fully talk about, is that going on? Is that still egalitarian? If there's a lot of that kind of status jockeying, it's just not overt. And I would have liked a little more discussion of that. But either way, the book was incredible. I was blown away by it. And I think this will be an important thing to understand if we're trying to redesign systems towards something that fits with human nature.